You are listening to Talking Star Wars. Welcome, Star Wars fans.
I'm Alex,
And I'm Connor,
and today we are going to talk about Star Wars.
as we do from time to time.
So, this episode is one of our ongoing series about the genre intersections between Star Wars and other media genres. We'll look back at our previous episodes where we talk about the genre intersection between Star Wars and Westerns, Star Wars and noir. But today our focus is on the intersection between Star Wars and sort of a more amorphous genre, the war movie, the war story.
So yeah, it's in the title. It is the concept of the universe in itself is that there is this intergalactic battle going on between mighty forces, and we open our first film within space during one of these very conflicts. So the idea of war was on the creator George Lucas's mind when sort of defining the different factions of good versus evil, and even designing much of the combat that was seen in that first film.
Yeah, but there's a difference between a story in which war occurs and a war story.
Mhm.
Specific types of characters that show up, types of scenes. So you could have, a story like Casablanca, where the fact that World War II is happening is driving the entire plot forward,
Mhm.
but Casablanca is not a war movie. But something like Saving Private Ryan or Dunkirk, war movies. Not only is war the driving force of the plot, but it is showing things like the effects of battle on individuals, even depicting the tactics used in those battles, and as an emphasis on the combat, not just as a sort of conflict between characters on an individual level, but on a broader ideological and large scale way.
And to really carve down, to whittle down to the core, Star Wars' story is this idealistic youth who volunteers for uh, war, for this rebellion, in order to overthrow this cruel, powerful machine. And in typical warlike fashion, it ends in a dogfight, in an aerial battle. We have these battles between different starships that are mirroring the sort of aerial combat that would have inspired George Lucas, especially from the different World War II stock footage that he actually based the effect shots on. He cut stock footage into the movie so that when it was just kind of scenes of sets and long dialogue, people would understand what the action would be like.
Yes, and George Lucas was certainly inspired by footage of World War II. There were many wars ongoing in his time in the 70s. The Vietnam War was a relatively recent memory and for everyone involved. But, large scale world wars were sort of a thing of the past by that
Mhm.
point, and another one has not yet occurred, even to the time of this recording. And George Lucas was not really in the business of glorifying war either, and Star Wars by itself, while it might glamorize sometimes the individual one on one showdown, war itself is usually depicted as sort of this rather brutal and horrible thing that happens between clashes between large forces. Even in the Clone Wars, where some of the clones are mythologized or portrayed
Mhm.
as unambiguously good, there's still collateral damage to civilian populations, starvation, famine, destruction, environmental devastation, and all of the side effects of war.
Yeah, the Empire is really depicted as uh, this again unstoppable force that's just going to overtake anything that they want. They come through and they trample through Tatooine and they burn Luke Skywalker's homestead and his relatives simply to get the military plans that they're looking for. And even, fast forwarding a movie into Empire Strikes Back, it's a film that begins with this invasion. It's the landing of these ground troops, this massive technology that is superior to anything that our heroes have, which uh, if you take a look at what could be World War II, where George Lucas is sort of depicting the Empire as the Nazi forces, where the armor, especially in Darth Vader and the
He
stormtroopers, are
calls them stormtroopers.
it's not an analogy of sorts. It's a direct connection. But then again, he's also kind of referencing this idea of Vietnam, where you have this. guerrilla-based rebellion of freedom fighters who are fighting against this much more technologically superior unified force, which at that time could have been seen as the United States. So it's almost a commentary on be careful of not just the this evil enemy power. Be aware of just any sort of organized power and make sure that freedom and uh, life is your main priority, not so much the militaristic technological advancement and destruction of innocent lives.
All right, well, going beyond the direct allegory for a moment,
Mhm.
let's look at what we call maybe the war genre, between
Mhm.
the war movie or the war story, and sort of identify what its key components are, and then look at those works in Star Wars that are either wholly inspired by or partially inspired by this genre.
So even with the Westerner noir, you need to have a protagonist. You need to have a lead. So who's your typical militaristic lead in a war story?
So the war genre is defined by several components. Usually, there is not a single protagonist. While there might be maybe one primary protagonist in a war story, you almost have the squad, the group,
The ensemble.
the band of brothers, if you will, to steal upon another great work as a work of nonfiction depicting this or dramatized nonfiction. Um, so yeah, usually you have the squad or the group. There's usually the mission. The war is ongoing, but you cannot tell a tight narrative story in a war story about the a war as a whole. So instead, you have the mission. In Saving Private Ryan, we have to go save Private Ryan. In the Guns of Navarone, we must blow up the Guns of Navarone. In Dunkirk, we must successfully evacuate Dunkirk. In 1917, we must deliver the message. So, in every war movie and war story is a smaller human story told within the context of to contextualize a conflict that is beyond the ability of one person to understand in anything but the most abstract.
And in Star Wars, we're trying to destroy the enemy's superweapon. That is the primary war goal in the first film.
Yeah,
From there, it gets a little more complicated.
but I would say that A New Hope is not a war story. It is a story about a war, but it simplifies the story too much for A New Hope to draw more than small parallels to the war genre. You don't really have the squad. You just have you have three protagonists. So that is classic hero's journey. So I would say A New Hope is not drawing is not wholly drawing on the war genre. Let's drill down on the genre a little bit more. So we have your squad, you have your mission. There is a war happening. The war is too large for individuals to really comprehend on the large scale, so we focus on the small scale. There's a look at the horrors of war. Often there's conflicted loyalties. There is the sense of loss and what people have given up due to the effects of war. Sometimes one side or the other, or both, are criticized. Look something like Full Metal Jacket, which is the second half of that movie is a war movie, and you can see the squad on their mission, and it is a harsh criticism of asymmetric warfare and the toll it takes on the young people forced to engage in it.
Well, not to be reductive, but I think the first Star Wars movie is, out of the original trilogy, the only movie that's close to the war genre because Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, while they have aspects of militaristic battle and sort of the trappings of a background of war, they're more so personal stories. And in the war genre, it's not so much about, I have to do this for these personal reasons. I have to do this for the sake of country, for the sake of nationalism, for the sake of making sure that no one's left behind and making sure that the enemy does not put their first step, beyond yours. And in that first Star Wars film, we see the between the polish and the sort of high excellence of the Empire compared to what Luke has outside of the Empire, where he is living in a dusty, just decrepit farm. We see what he has to deal with on Tatooine. It's advancing from that to trying to infiltrate the enemy weapon to save the only prisoner who has the secret to
Yeah.
destroying the
That,
enemy weapon.
so,
This is going through the motions of setting up your ensemble to destroy the enemy super weapon. This is
yeah.
the war movie of Star Wars.
That is more of an espionage part. I would say the moment in which a movie.
I think that's baloney. Espionage movies don't end in dogfights. War movies end
Well,
in dogfights.
well, I would say that the moment that A New Hope then truly starts immerses itself in the war genre would be during the briefing to attack the Death Star. Before that, we're sort of in a spy, fantasy, sci-fi medley. But then once we have our group of pilots gathered in the briefing room with General Dodonna there to talk about their plans, we had everyone leading off their call signs and their attack on the Death Star. That we have our manly men in their flight suits ready to blow the Death Star out of the sky. They start dropping like flies while our generals look on in concern with headsets speaking into loudspeakers. That is quintessential war genre. That is we've now caught. We have the squad. We have the mission. We have the faceless enemy. Go.
I think in that case, then the only movie in the Star Wars genre or piece of media that is true to being a war film would be Rogue One, the spin-off. Each film in the Star Wars story has aspects of this idea of war, but like you said, it's they're each a medley, they're each a conglomeration. That's why we have this idea of genres focus because it's the sort of uh, zooming in that we're doing to dissect what these little aspects of Star Wars are.
Yeah.
So
Well, yeah. Connor took my point ahead of me, but yes, we'll look at the other films and aspects and shows and books and so on in a moment. But the only movie of the films that Star Wars has released to date that is truly primarily a war story is Rogue One. And that is we have our growing squad of soldiers. We have they have a mission that they need to complete, and the mission is not to win the war. The mission is to complete a part that will help end the war. But even by the success at the end of the movie, they have not successfully toppled the Empire. They have only succeeded in beaming the plans off of Scarif. Our main characters are killed off one at a time in a realistic fashion. While they do occasionally get dramatic deaths, um, a couple people die in the arms of each other. It's also, K2SO is just blown to pieces. We have Baze Malbus just gunned down after his rampage after the death of Chirrut Inwe. So we have the famous and incredibly well done scene with their insurgency, setting up sight lines and ambushes for Imperial troops on Scarif, and blowing up key targets all at once using relatively believable small squad tactics, to the degree that you can in Star Wars. So that scene where things start exploding and the garrison is deployed is a quintessential war movie scene. So I would say yes, Rogue One is a war movie first, and every other genre second.
and it culminates again in your dogfight where you have the sort of new the rebellious forces have been growing for quite some time. I've seen in Rebels, I've seen in Andor, but this sort of great unification first occurs in order to meet at Scarif and in order to benefit Jin and her team. And we have this pretty excellent again dogfight where we have the rebels trying to sort of intercept the planet before this planetary shield closes. And visually speaking, it's fantastic, and this could be seen as some sort of blockade in front of some sort of military garrison closing in just this last ditch effort of the rebels trying to slip in before that shield goes up. Very militaristic, very exhilarating for a climax of the film.
Yeah, so the climax of the film is the battle. There is a personal conflict as well, which is not uncommon in even more realistic war movies. Even in Saving Private Ryan, you have the quiet moments between Ryan and Captain Miller. You have the confrontation between the freed German POW and the other men that he kills. So there is still this personal element going on, even if the enemy is largely faceless and monolithic, we'll
Yeah,
say.
it's a historical fiction, the war genre. So in fiction, you still need to have those characters that you relate to, those sort of goals that you can still relate with. Um, so in Jin, we have someone who is very connected to this imperial side whose father is responsible for the creation of a technological death weapon. It is the atom bomb uh, in the Star Wars world, and being able to see that kind of guilt in the relationship is something that's very affecting and would be very parallel to what happens in a war movie. I mean, Oppenheimer, which is at the time of this recording has recently come out, is entirely about the nature of why does a super weapon need to be created? How does this affect the universe once it has been created? And what sort of guilt do you have to process once you have been responsible for making such a thing?
Yeah, interesting to note with the war genre, there's never the thought that um, we need to make our own Death Star to fight the Empire's Death Star.
Mhm.
Unlike the Soviet Union, who's like, we must make our nukes to fight against the nukes of the um, United States.
And they'll be bigger and better nukes. No,
Yeah,
it's
or even in Lord of the Rings, where it's like you must use the One Ring against
mhm.
Sauron. The rebels never think of capturing the Death Star. They
Yeah.
view its very existence as evil,
Mhm.
which is again why Star Wars is primarily a sci-fi fantasy story.
Right.
But when it intersects with these other genres, you could see those parts start to supersede it, even in this greater sci-fi fantasy heroic story background.
Mhm.
So I think let's look at some of the other works of Star Wars, both the films and
Yeah. Some
otherwise,
of the
where
broader wars in the galaxy that take place other than the Empire versus Rebel war that we are introduced to from the beginning of the franchise.
and I think we can look at other scenes,
Mhm.
characters, and sort of parts of movies that are heavily inspired by the war genre.
Mhm.
So we talked about A New Hope fairly extensively. Empire Strikes Back probably is the other than the opening battle at Hoth.
Mhm.
So that was probably the strongest war scene. It is a
Mhm.
big battle. The rebels lose and have to evacuate. So one-sided insurgency. We see Vader as General Ripper killing his own men for failing him.
Mhm.
Uh, but I would say The Empire Strikes Back is more of a personal narrative, more characterized by duels, running away, and interpersonal conflict, more so than the war genre. There is a battle that
Mhm.
happens, but it does not take a lot of inspiration from the war genre as a whole.
It's a flip side of what we get with A New Hope, where instead of culminating in this warlike battle, we open up our film, and then the characters, that's where our narrative focus is. So they leave the rebellion entirely uh, in order to train and then hide amongst the asteroid potatoes. Yes, there were actual potatoes in the asteroid field in Empire Strikes Back as a little Easter egg for you.
Yeah, but then we go on to Return of the Jedi, and this is one where I think more so than just a dogfight, we get a ground war
Mm-hmm.
scene, similar to Hoth, but in a more militaristic way. Han Solo assembles a team of rebellion rangers, and they go on a mission to the Forest Moon of Endor. It reminds and there's a squad, there's a mission, there's a briefing by a
Mm-hmm.
general of Mon Mothma.
There's a hologram with schematics.
Yeah, there's espionage has been committed to get the plans to go blow up the weapon. So this is quintessential war movie stuff. You know, Lando and Han quipping back and forth about the men that they need, assembling the team, each individual story, and then of course Luke splits off to have his father-son confrontation. Leia has to confront the reality of her parentage. Lando is our face for the space battle happening above, and Han Solo remains on the ground with the Ewoks, along with Leia, to fight the ground war.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say the climax of Return of the Jedi again falls back to the war genre and tells a war story. I mean, particularly everything leading up to the infiltration of the shield generator on
Mm-hmm.
Endor.
Yeah, it's the most on the nose as far as this small guerrilla, you know, highly unqualified militaristic force against the Imperial machine. Where that has always been what Star Wars has represented, this is very much face forward. You have a tribe of these diminutive teddy bears who win the day, and it's not, it's one thing that I still respect in Star Wars because the fact that they could overcome the Empire, the fact that the Empire would have been probably just underestimating this force, and the fact that you have Han Solo who is, just uh, can never be hit by a laser blast. So that's lucky to be on your side there. Unlucky if you're Princess Leia standing right next to him, though.
Yeah, track the laser bolts yourself. So we go to the prequel era, and I would say, you know, Star Wars makes a tradition of having a climactic battle happening somewhere.
Hmm.
The most war movie like part of the Phantom Menace would be the Gungan War battle, or ground battle against the droid armies of the Trade Federation outside of Theed. You have
Meanwhile,
you
yeah.
have a shield
Mhm.
wall. You have artillery, artillery barrages. So it almost
Mhm.
resembles like a 13th, 14th century fight between two opposing forces.
And you have a battle in the stars where you have the Trade Federation shield generators, and Anakin finds himself in a Nabooian ship, and spins and blows one up. So it's three battles happening in climactic succession, along with Darth Maul battling Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan at the same time. Uh, you could have tied these together if you had some aerial combat in the Gungan battle and had Anakin play a part in that.
Yeah,
Just as far as a narrative structure goes, but just because the Gungan battle doesn't have a driving protagonist, because we are not the film does not encourage us to care for Jar Jar Binks and his livelihood.
yeah. You're never really worried that Jar Jar Binks is going to get shot, which
Mhm.
does rob that battle of some gravitas.
Yeah.
Jar Jar Binks is not a war movie character.
Mhm.
He's not grizzled, traumatized, or realistic enough.
He
Uh,
could be your boob in a Seven Samurai style battle where he's part of this ensemble and he somehow shows his worth, but he's not the sole uh, character connection in a ground battle that we should
yeah, he's
have.
a slapstick comedy character who wanders into a war scene. Uh, yeah, and I think you're right in that you can see the evolution of by the time they shoot Rogue One, they're like, oh yes, let's have our space, ground, personal conflicts all feed narratively off of each other,
Hmm.
rather than these three rather, I mean, all interesting plot lines, but
Hmm.
rather splintered and disconnected ones between the space battle above Naboo, the ground battle outside of Theed, and the duel of fates between Obi-Wan, Qui-Gon Jinn, and Darth Maul.
Yeah, just imagine flipping some of those characters around and just having an interesting interplay of who would be where. There are just different ways to do that, but that we're not here to crap upon the Phantom Menace, but like other Star Wars films, this is the one front-facing aspect that is much like a war movie, where when we get to Attack of the Clones, it's much the same, where a lot of it is espionage
Yeah.
until we get to the climax.
Yeah, and again, one scene, which really, when the clones show up into the arena at Geonosis, you actually have the clones themselves are very militaristic, and as we'll talk about in the Clone Wars, that has that's more of a war series. That is your Mash. That is your Band of Brothers
For
in the
kids,
Clone
though,
Wars.
uh,
But,
for young adolescents to adults, I would say.
yeah, even though it gets fairly brutal at times, and we'll get to a couple of
Mhm.
arcs in the Clone Wars that are peak war movie, not just about with war as their driving focus.
Mhm.
But in Attack of the Clones, you get the military orders being given and the first battle of Geonosis happening. But there's not a lot of focus is given to the
Mhm.
actual ground battle, other than a few scenes with Mace Windu, Ki-Adi-Mundi, and Yoda leading some
Mhm.
forces. The focus is on the personal conflict between Dooku, Anakin, and Obi-Wan.
I will say, watching that the whole entire final act in theaters, and even watching it today, I absolutely love everything that I've seen, and I know that it's a big detractor for many Star Wars fans. Just the whole entire Geonosis battle, they hate how it looks. To me, Star Wars is kind of a cartoon. It has always been a mixture of real and magic, so it's not going to. I don't know. It's We're fighting in a gigantic craggy rock landscape with 10,000 identical soldiers. It's going to look like a science fiction battle,
Yeah,
so
and then it's the first
it's
time you've seen
exhilarating.
it's the first time you've seen that many people with lightsabers in the
Hmm.
same place in any media. So
And
seeing
yeah,
100 Jedi hold off a droid army was new for the time.
it's the shock of these clones who look like stormtroopers who are fighting for the good guys. They're fighting alongside the Jedi. It's something that we didn't expect as fans.
Yeah, and
Mhm.
sort of a twist at the time in that Sidious there actually allows the Republic to control the
Yeah.
clones until he doesn't need that to happen anymore.
So it's your typical aspect of war movies where the cavalry has arrived, where uh, we have our allies storming in to help us in our moment where we think we are at our darkest, which is a narrative structure that expands past just the war genre, but it's also very typical of that idea of having those reinforcements save you in the moment of most dramatic need.
Yeah. Despite the fact that it is the climax of a war, um, Revenge of the Sith actually does not have a lot of war movie inspired aspects. There's the battle above Coruscant at the very beginning, but and we see broadsides of ships being shot at each other,
Mhm.
which has a little bit of the genre, but mostly it's the mission of Obi-Wan and Anakin to rescue Palpatine. And the rest of the movie is actually, having recently rewatched Revenge of the Sith, fairly moves at a pretty good clip.
Mhm.
There's really only two plots to this movie, and that is the personal story of Anakin and Padme, and then Obi-Wan sort of investigating the war, the Outer Rim siege on Umbara, not Umbara, Utapau,
Mhm.
and trying to find Grievous. So,
There's a there's an or unfortunate only in that it's tragic, but there's a connection between Order 66, I feel, and something like Crystal Knocked, where it's this one fell swoop in order to make a massive statement against this group that will soon be subjugated, where we have the militaristic force uh, gathering up and executing all Jedi in one fell swoop, except for that 1% of 10,000 Jedi, so there's like 100 out there, which is still 100 Jedi versus three AT-ATs, not going to go too well. Um,
yeah, and Order 66 was certainly almost took some inspiration from the Night of Long Knives, which was the 1934 purge in Nazi Germany by the Nazi Party, where sealed orders are given out, all unsealed at the same time, to purge undesirable elements from this growing fascist state. Given the fact that we have a fascist state in A New Hope that is then needs to be toppled, the illusion was probably fairly deliberate.
and it's not, all Nazis. It's something that is global. It's something that is Roman. It's something that is biblical, where it's, kill every single firstborn child because there's a prophecy that one will overthrow me. That's something. It's a tale of those in power taking the most extreme measures.
Yeah, but for a war movie in
Yeah.
that kind of genre to exist, you need the advent of mechanized or large scale warfare.
Mhm.
Um, you can't have
Yeah.
fascism without industrial warfare.
Exactly. And
Yeah,
that's to go back to the idea of the Death Star. We don't have this back and forth between two different ideologies battling with their super weapons. It's just the Empire and First Order cannibalizing their own technology to make a bigger and better or a more mobile Death Star. That is their MO. And I think we're done with Death Stars. I think we need something else that can damage a planet widespread in the Star Wars franchise.
well, Operation Cinder showed that off,
Mm,
but um,
yeah.
which we'll get to in a minute because it's
Mhm.
part of the plot of Battlefront 2, which has a story to it. So just to do a quick review of our final three movies or
Mhm.
four movies. Solo. Um,
It's
we have
a
a scene of a bunch of
ooh,
FNGs in a trench engaging in some warfare.
and they
Um,
don't even know who they're fighting, and it ends up that they're battling themselves, isn't it?
yeah, on Mimbin.
Hmm.
Um, so so Han Solo starts off at a crime movie, wanders into a war movie, and decides I don't want to be in the war movie anymore. I want to go back to the crime movie. And
Hmm.
so he goes back to the crime movie as soon as he can.
Hmm.
Almost deliberate. He's like, I'm in the wrong genre now. I belong not on the battlefield. I need to somewhere where I can look dashing.
I signed up for the bandit genre, not the war genre.
So it's almost a deliberate escape from his brush with the war
Hmm.
genre for Han Solo until he's like, and then when he's back at it, he's like, yes, now I'll lead a team to Endor, but that's not for another 20 years, 15
Hmm.
years. So um, in the sequel trilogy,
Hmm.
you have the battle against the First Order at the end of The Force Awakens, and you also have the battle at the castle of Takodana, Maz Kanata's castle.
And it's a visual kind of representation of a firebombing of this. I don't think we've quite seen that in aerial firebombing. the Empire will send ground forces to take care of the other ground forces. We haven't seen quite a explosive battle like that where the TIE fighters come in and just kind of swarm and attack.
Yes, you see air power, you see dropships deploying troops. I mean, the very first scene of the movie is Finn inside the Imperial ground shuttle, engaging in a suppression action against the helpless village. So, drawing from the darker side of the war genre there.
The Empire feels like an actual bureaucratic organization where you have maybe some bankers and some military people and some scientists. The First Order feels like the military. There's nothing but military conscription under the First
Well, yeah,
Order.
they're not as much a government as like a bandit junta. So they rely entirely on military force and indentured servitude to get their way.
Enforce their rule.
Yeah, you never get the sense that there's a bunch of bureaucratic first order accounts somewhere
Mm-hmm.
counting all of it. You get the sense that when the first order needs things, they roll up to a system, point their guns at the planet, and say, "Give us supplies now."
Mm-hmm.
The closest we see to the first order engaging in politics and bureaucracy is probably in the Star Wars Resistance show, where they actually do put on the veneer of trying to be a legitimate government, but you always get the sense that it's a veneer.
Mm-hmm.
They never actually try to be a legitimate government. They're like the perpetual opposition state to the New Republic.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that the New Republic exists means that they're sort of pigeonholed into this resistance
Mm-hmm.
state, even though then a resistance forms to them due to
Because they're not resisting enough.
yeah. So yeah, so the First Order is never quite the monolith that the
Mm-hmm.
Empire seems to be, just because they never do have that much power, even though they are frightening and fanatical, much more
Mm-hmm.
fanatical than the Empire was by design.
Yeah. And then when we get to the Last Jedi, we have this chase that's happening from the First Order fleet chasing the dwindling Resistance, which I don't know if I've seen that in a kind of war movie. I suppose you could see like maybe some naval battle where you have uh, the large cruisers that are trying to chase down the smaller clipper who's running out of fuel.
You would see this more in the sort of the wooden ship and Iron Man genre
Hmm.
of ships,
Mm,
almost like something out of Master and Commander, where you
sure.
would have these chase scenes with the bow guns that last for days across the ocean. So
Mhm.
that would be the genre we're kind of
There we
stealing
go.
from for that part, which is not quite the war genre.
It's,
That's
it's naval combat.
yeah, but
It's
it's not the modern mechanized war
sure.
genre. There's no
Oh, ships are
mission.
machines, cannons,
Yeah,
better propellers. No,
yeah.
that's not the naval ships, but
Yeah, we'll talk about the
the
intersection of
masts.
the naval genre some other time. But we really get a war scene on the Battle
Mhm.
of Crete. We have
Mhm.
trenches. We have the unconcerned old soldier going forward to cast look at the enemy. We have
Mhm.
old machines being repurposed, and then fighting a last stand inside a mountain redoubt.
Yeah.
So the whole Battle of Crete is definitely drawing on
Mhm.
the sort of the war genre.
I'd say between Crate and the naval uh, hunt, that's this next to Rogue One has the most feel of a war movie, just for what its many plots are trying to accomplish.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. I would say
Yeah.
you could see it even happening in like a World War II movie,
Mhm.
the final um, fight in the
Final siege,
trenches.
yeah. And when we get to the Rise of Skywalker, there is a fantastic scene where I believe the Knights of Ren and the First Order troops are going through a planet whose name I cannot recall, but it's stormy and very much akin to something like World War II, where you have these militaristic forces going door to door searching for these specific uh,
There's Kamiji from the
criminals.
Spice Runners of Kamiji.
There we go. Where Goldhead's from. Good old Goldhead. Everyone's favorite Carrie Russell cameo. Uh, Lover of Poe Dameron. She's got a name. Taco Ship? Taco Donna? Taco
Takoda's Vazcanata's planet.
Wiz Khalifa. That's a Star Wars sounding name.
Poe Dameron's old flame Zori Bliss, who is his one of the leaders of the Spice Runners of Kamiji. So you see sort of an occupied planet with stormtroopers going door to door. But yeah, there's not a whole lot of the war genre in The Rise of Skywalker. You
Mhm.
you do get the ex deserting stormtroopers and they charge and there's this big battle, but it's not really falling into the right tropes. It's more of a fantasy genre. This is more the Knights of the Rohirrim arriving at Minas Tirith, and where the flow of the battle is dictated more by the fortunes of everyone overall, rather than trying to depict clever military tactics or a small group of people engaged in a mission. The mission is to win the war.
The movie has far many other handicaps for it to worry about genre. It's doing so much that it doesn't have to do, and it's a whole entire other fish. But it does have one solid military scene. The First Order is trying to infiltrate this occupied city and search their dastardly criminals in the form of Rey and her friends.
Yeah. So then I think we can talk just sort of a survey of other works in Star Wars greater media that draw upon the war genre. The Clone Wars has this in spades due
Mhm.
to its name. Many of our main characters are soldiers in the Grand Army of the Republic, clones. We even get such as the attack on the listening post where we first meet Fives um, uh, and his compatriots. Um, Fives and Echoes first meet them so they're even the FNGs, the shinies, and they have to be mentored by their old soldiers and lead an insurgent action against an occupying force. So that's a but probably the best war arc that is self-contained and horrifying and depicts all of the effects of war at a low level would be the Umbaran arc in the Clone Wars.
Yeah, it has to do with that idea of foreign enemy technology not being able to actually function it quite as well, uh, and how to deal with this environment that is so different from your own in order to overcome an enemy that you don't quite understand, which reflects war in a very interesting way because in the Great War in World War II, it seems so very clear who the heroes and enemies are, but in many wars the definition is not clear. Not that this so much has to, show that we don't get the sense that the Umbarans are necessarily the heroes of the story, but we have this sense of mystery where we don't know what their motivations or what their technology is all about.
Yeah. Um, the members of the 501st trying to use the Umbaran um, fighters. It's almost straight out of the war movie U-571, where the Americans who have boarded the German submarine are trying to figure out how to pilot the submarine, and all the instructions are in German, so
Mm-hmm.
they don't really know what to do. Despite opposite sides in the same war, and you see how communication can even be impossible.
And an interesting aspect of the show in general is just the idea of the Jedi as these generals and how their styles of leadership are different. We get to see the development of Ahsoka Tano and her successes and failures as commander, and kind of how she has to deal with the guilt of losing battles and losing soldiers, and
Now, Jedi aren't
yeah,
supposed to feel guilt.
yeah.
They're supposed to accept that they tried to make the best decision, but war when philosophy meets war, often war wins. And I think it was a depiction of how the Jedi were naive to think that they could throw all of their Jedi into a war and not provide things like psychological counseling, understanding that, someone like Pong Krell might turn out to have a sadistic streak, or that Barris Ophi might suffer from post traumatic stress disorder and decide to become a radicalized resistor of the war. Um, you have so many different fallen Jedi, damaged Jedi, as the effect of the war, you even have um, Quinlan Voss falls to the dark side during the war. It has to be, as it's seen in the Dark Disciple, it has to be drawn back. So, and Anakin Skywalker, the quintessential example in the Clone Wars, you see the effects of war and battle and the decisions he has to make, forcing him closer and closer to the dark side, even without having to keep the secret of his love for Padme.
And that's not even to mention all the political aspects of the show, which, a political genre doesn't necessarily have to make a war genre, but in this case, it's the politics of war. And you have all the machinations of Palpatine publicly in the Senate, him battling Amidala for different controls over forces of the universe, to his more subversive tactics as Palpatine manipulating the separatist side as
Yeah.
well.
Palpatine, he's like, I need ancient Sith artifacts and need to kidnap force sensitive children, but I also need to control the banking clan.
Mhm.
So he's like, I need to remove checks and balances on my role as Chancellor, and I will have plans to do all of the above.
So he is a public face of this politician who can accomplish anything, but in the dark, shady secrets, he's an evil wizard who performs different uh, ceremonies and is trying to groom a young child to be his follower. This isn't reflective of the modern day whatsoever.
Yeah. So the Clone Wars, the whole like half of the episodes are war genre, from the Battle of
Mhm.
Christophsis to the Umbaran arc to the Siege of Mandalore. There's a great scene, anyone who's seen the Clone Wars will remember, where Obi-Wan opens some blasters from a hangar and just the explosions and blaster fire is going forward. He's trying to save one person, but it is, it's like running through the battlefield in 1917, where it's just overwhelming for one person, and he can't, he is a Jedi, but even a Jedi cannot stop or solve this battle. And this is towards the end of the series. So
Mhm.
we finally reach the point where one Jedi sometimes cannot make the difference, and all he can't even
Mhm.
save the woman that he loves.
So so much is covered in the Clone Wars, and that's why whenever we get into the Clone Wars, it's kind of like this black hole because there's such a fantastic variety in storytelling, and it just so happens that this is entirely focused on a war, and it's very refreshing to see the a backdrop of a different type of war compared to, again, what we're introduced to with Empire versus Rebellion. But we do have a show in Star Wars Rebels, so how would you say that show is framed as far as a show about a band of rebels versus being a war genre show? Where does it fall?
So they are basically they are a cell. Um, the Empire would call them a terrorist cell. They would call themselves a resistance cell. It gets closer to the war genre later, particularly in the third season, after there's a little bit of a time skip, where our characters are aged up a little more. When they are engaged in missions, they work for a military hierarchy. They all hold military rank. They have a squadron they're attached to. Earlier, but Rebels never really quite commits to the war genre because it keeps the scales smaller. You get the sense that there's a war happening, but the war is not really there. The Rebel Alliance is sort of in the nascent stages. So while you do get some parts of the war genre in Rebels, particularly in some of the missions, it's more of an asymmetrical freedom fighter revolution
Mm-hmm.
story than a war story.
Sure. So it's very
Um,
much from their point of view, whereas Clone Wars is from the perspective of, again, it's that ensemble. It's not just your core protagonist. It's a widespread focus of all of the different parts of the
yeah,
war machine.
if a war requires two opposing political entities to be battling it out on the battlefield, the Rebel Alliance eventually exists that can fight a war against the Empire. They can't before they exist, and the Rebels is how they come to
Mhm.
exist.
Yeah, they
Um,
need to organize. They need to, and it's so interesting how in different media, like in Rebels and in uh, Andor, we have just different angles of how the rebellion forms, and that culminates in Rogue One, which leads us to A New Hope.
yeah, so you need to first get enough support to reach the war genre. You have to have made it into a war, and
Mm-hmm.
that is how what Rebels and Andor both explore. Um, Kenobi is, I mean, there's it's a living under a fascist regime.
Mm-hmm.
There is no war scenes. There's never enough people on the screen to do that.
It's so
Um,
personal to his own character journey.
mhm. um, Resistance. There's some dogfighting scenes. I'm not going to talk a ton about it. Resistance,
Mm-hmm.
not really drawing too much from the war genre. It's more about the like defensive community a little bit, trying to fit into a hierarchy. But we never really again the that is mostly about the people trying to stay out of the war,
Mm-hmm.
and the New Republic has already fallen by the time we really get into it at that point. So we'll talk a ton about Resistance, but then there's some other expanded universe media where we get war stories. Um, there are two Star Wars Battlefront novels. One about Twilight Company, which is the quintessential military novel. Like you could have just put all the characters in, working their way through Vichy France to try to free it from the Nazis, and it would sort of make sense. The captain dies, the sergeant becomes the captain. It's a company with its own unique traditions. It's drawing a lot of inspiration from Glenn Cook's The Black Company, with the Twilight Company, and despite being tied into a mediocre video game, I would say that um, Battlefront Twilight Company is the purest war novel that the novels have produced. You get an emphasis on logistics, tactics, strategy, recruitment, how people process grief, the law and loss, and how the greater stakes of a war can largely vanish and people are fighting day to day and they start just fighting for the people around them. Even that we have characters who don't really even know what the ideology of the rebellion is or care much. they've fallen in with the rebellion because they didn't want to be under the Empire, and then they stay around for the people that they surround themselves with.
Mhm.
Very very Glenn Cook of them. And then there's another Battlefront novel, Inferno Squadron, which is from the perspective of the Empire, but that is not really a war novel. That one is an espionage novel. It's a bunch of Imperials go undercover to try to infiltrate a rebel cell, which they do. So that was more of an espionage spy thriller.
And when it comes to Battlefront, we'll talk more about those games when we get to an episode on video games. Uh, I'm trying to remember what my mother said about if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. And I'll follow that now, but I won't follow that in our video game episode.
But we also talk about the original Battlefront, Star Wars
Yes.
Battlefront, which is both a great
The
depiction of
Guerilla.
war,
Yeah.
but yeah. So I think you have other scenes and other novels. You have other wars that are fought. Star Wars sometimes very, and then the other novel series that's worth mentioning, two of them would be the Aftermath trilogy and the Alphabet Squadron trilogy, both of which delve deeply into a very realistically depicted military culture. You have defectors. You have how do you move on after a war. You have the after effects of war. You have the infamous Battle of Jakku, so also depicted in Lost Stars. So those seven novels I mentioned, the Aftermath trilogy, the Alphabet Squadron trilogy, and Lost Stars, also heavily draw upon the war genre. The trilogies more so than Lost Stars, but Lost Stars does culminate in the Battle of Jakku, and depicts two characters in two very different militaries as their main protagonists. Um, but if you're looking for like the darkest, most brutal war story Star Wars has ever told, read Alphabet Squadron. No one in that novel is happy, and most of them die. And you see, I mean, one of our main characters, he wants to be a pacifist from his pacifist planet and go home and like raise a family, but he keeps having to stick around and be ace pilot in Rogue Squad and Alphabet Squadron, and it just kills him inside every time. And he's forced to take command, and he still can't. You know, sometimes it shows there are wounds people can't heal from. There are things that can't be forgiven, and can't bring people back to life. You just sort of muddle through the best you can. Where a lot of Star Wars is very, I would say, idealistic. Like, we blew up the Death Star,
Hmm.
the war's over. Star Wars has taken a turn more recently into being a little bit less idealistic about that, in that you have to change the structures and the way, like, what's the reason that
Hmm.
this blew up? Like, oh, it used to be this optimism. It's like, okay, Hitler shot himself in his bunker and Germany's freed, and now we're all good. But now, Palpatine blew up on the second Death Star, and we're all great. But it's like, what happened to all the Moffs that supported him? Uh, what happened to the structure of power that put Palpatine in place? And there's been a more focus on how that could or should be dismantled or changed.
I say like to sum things up, you have the start of the franchise, which is this again amalgamation of a dozen different genres. And it's only because Star Wars has lasted so long and has been explored in so many avenues that we have had an opportunity in order to have it explore war more specifically. So we have entries, the big ticket ones being Rogue One and or to some extent, even though that's as much about uh, again building up that war and not so much the fighting of it. Um, I would, in both of these, we have the sense of the galaxy outside of the Force. I would love to see some contemporary means of, what does a live action battle in the Star Wars universe look like where it's taken from this dramatic, realistic angle, but one of them happens to be a Jedi with a lightsaber. Just to kind of see what that sort of conflict would be amongst the more pragmatic uh, soldiers versus the dogmatic Jedi. We get some of that in the Clone Wars, but a lot of that, clones don't argue and fight back as much as your rebels do.
Yeah. So, if your dad is a war movie fan, or
Mm-hmm.
you have your uncle's a war movie fan, you want to introduce him to Star Wars, your quintessential war movie or war story Star Wars. Watch the Clone Wars, watch Rogue One, read the Aftermath trilogy, read Alphabet Squadron, and um, go play the original Star Wars Battlefront 2.
Yes, and you'll look forward to hearing more about that very soon. So,
All right. Well, thank you for joining us today for our exploration of the war genre and how it intersects with Star Wars as far as its tropes, its aspects, and its types of scenes and characters. If you have any thoughts about other works that featured great aspects of the war genre, I mean, not great aspects, but
Yeah.
aspects of the war genre. Drop us a comment on our subreddit or anywhere else you see this podcast. And thank you for your time today.
Take it easy.